Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and start recording. I'd like to welcome everybody to our program today. My name is Sue Quincy. I'm with the DEEP out of the Kellogg Environmental Center as one of the education resource centers for the state. And I am going to be moderating and watching from the shadows. If anyone has any problems or questions, I'll try and help you out. But as you enter, again, I ask that everybody make sure that their audio is muted so we don't have a lot of feedback or background noise. And if your video is also turned off, that helps with reception and everybody has a clear channel to listen to. So if you have any questions, I think probably many of us have been on Zoom meetings or Zoom presentations, but if this is your first visit to Zoom, check out your toolbar, and on your toolbar you should have some options there to help you communicate with us and with other people. You'll be using what is called the chat. If you have any questions, just type them in, make sure it goes to everyone, or if you wanted to do a private message, you would type in a private question to Russ Miller. Russ is going to be introducing our speaker today and giving some background. So I am going to turn it over to Russ and mute myself.
Thank you, Sue. So I am Russ Miller. I run the Meggs Point Nature Center here at Hammonasset Beach State Park. This is the first Zoom that we're doing, I guess not from the Nature Center, but through the Nature Center. And we're really excited to do this program. I want to let everybody know that we do have some other programs coming up. So if you go to meggspointnaturecenter.org, there's a calendar of events right there. You can see all of the other events we have coming up. They're going to be similar to this one. And you can sign up ahead of time so that you get the password to join us for those. I also want to say the Nature Center does Facebook Live programs from Tuesday to Friday at 11 o'clock and 2 o'clock every day. We do a Facebook Live program, so you can tune in and see some different animals. Today we did talk about horseshoe crabs this morning. So let's get right into the talk this evening. I want to welcome Dr. May. She is a professor at Sacred Heart University, also the founder and director of Project Limulus, which we're going to find much more out about. And I'm really excited to have Dr. May talk about horseshoe crabs, one of the most fascinating animals to me. So I am going to mute myself and listen. If you have questions, drop them in and we'll have points where we can answer those questions as we go.
Okay, thank you, Russ, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I have a couple of objectives for this talk. One is to sort of increase your basic knowledge of the biology and ecology of these unique animals, the horseshoe crab. And another one is to try to get you to become stewards of these animals and, in fact, stewards of Long Island Sound as well, their home. And, the list in front of you are just some interesting facts, which I will touch on. But basically, this is not, my slides are not advancing. Oh, this is a problem. Oh, there they go. I got it now. Okay, so the, lost my train of thought. Oh gosh, this is not advancing. Are you advancing, Russ? Oh, now it's, okay, so it's almost, sorry about that. Technical difficulties on these Zoom meetings.
This is Sue Quincy. You may want to have to make sure to advance. There is down in the left-hand corner, a little back and forth arrow. So your pointer might have to be on that in order to advance them.
Okay. Alrighty. I think it's working now. Okay. So, so getting back to my points here was that, so why should we care about these animals? And they're really ugly, right? So most people react in horror when they see these animals. But I'm going to try to convince you by the end of the talk that they're very well worth our while to not only learn about them, but to conserve them and teach others also about their importance. Particularly, I wanted to point out that this is our first International Horseshoe Crab Day, is going to be celebrated on June 20th. And it would be really wonderful if each of you on this webinar today could teach 4 or 5 other people a little bit of something about what you learned today. So that's our objective by having an International Horseshoe Crab Day, is to spread the information about them. Because they are so important. And so what, before we get into the nuts and bolts of horseshoe crab biology, first thing you do in any animal or plant that you look at is to try to figure out what its name is. So what are they? They're so weird looking. Well, they're in the phylum arthropods, and arthropods you know very well from insects and other organisms that have an exoskeleton, so a shell on the outside, and jointed legs. So horseshoe crabs, it seem like it would be related to them since we call them crabs, but no, they are not related to crabs. They're actually in a different subphylum, the Chelicerata, and actually they are in a class by themselves because they're so different from all the other organisms that we see out there. And their most, I guess, close relatives would include the spider and the scorpion. But that tail that you see is not, or the telson as it's called, is not a stinger. So these animals do not sting. Now the name Project Limulus comes from the genus of this species. Limulus polyphemus is its full Latin name. And in Latin, it means glancing sideways because they have those 2 big eyes on the sides of the front of their shell. And polyphemus refers to the Greek mythology with the giant with the 1 eye in the middle of his head, because these funny animals have the eyes, a cluster of eyes in the middle of their head. So that's where they get that name. These are the 2 big compound eyes on the right and left sides, and they can see. It's very good to have your eyes on the sides of your head if you're looking for motion. So they look for each other actually in the cloudy waters of Long Island Sound. Particularly at this time of year, they get together to come up and lay eggs. So they ended up with at least 2 big compound eyes and 8 other eyes that detect light. So they can detect any small amounts of light at night. And like tonight with the full moon, it'll be just like daytime for them. And they'll come up on the beaches possibly to lay eggs tonight, or maybe in a couple weeks' time. So other species, the Limulus polyphemus, the American horseshoe crab, is only found in the US and along the eastern United States, but there are 3 other species that live in Eastern Asia and Southern Asia. And I'm on a committee of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, where we are trying to save all 4 species from extinction. So here's a distribution map. So in the US, the populations can be found from Maine all the way down to Florida. There's a few that have been found in Texas, but not very many. The majority is on the East Coast here, and there's a small population right around the Yucatan Peninsula. And this is the distribution of the other 3 species in Asia. Okay, so what horseshoe crabs need to survive are estuaries. So this is where rivers empty into the ocean, or in our case, into Long Island Sound. Like we study them on the Housatonic. They're often found at the mouth of that river. You can see them all up and down the coast of Connecticut on beaches, and even in the marshes now. they're coming up to feed. The juveniles need the marshes to survive. And we've had some evidence that the adults will go out in the deeper parts of the sound, but they never go off the continental shelf. They're not deep sea creatures at all. They like to be on the coast. And so our International Horseshoe Crab Day, we're celebrating this species in particular as a flagship species for coastal habitat conservation. So seawalls and groins spell bad news for the horseshoe crab. So as I mentioned, when even kids see them for the first time, they look horrified, as this little girl is the first time she's ever seen one. And basically we teach immediately, you can hold them, you can put them on your arm and they won't hurt you, they don't sting, they don't bite, you know, so that any age group could come and help us with our tagging program and our counting program. And so far we've had no injuries, except maybe myself. I jabbed myself with the awl that we used to put the hole for the tags. But other than that, they are completely harmless. And so horseshoe crabs don't hurt us, so please do not hurt them. I can't tell you how many times I've seen, just teenagers on the shores or others thinking that they're horrible and that they need to be buried or killed or something. But we're telling you that they really should not be, because they are completely harmless. And they're important, actually, to the ecology of the sound. And these are a couple of my grad students studying them. Shout out to Kim out on Block Island, where she was helping us do some tagging in Rhode Island. So how to hold a horseshoe crab: if you grab it by the telson or its tail there, it can break off, and that is very bad for them for survival purposes. So I'd always tell kids, hold them like a bowl of rice, and it's easy to flip them back over if they get turned upside down. And what the purpose of that telson is to dig into the sand when they do get flipped upside down. And so if you see them upside down, they cannot bake in the sun and they can get eaten by gulls and things like that. So a good thing to do is to flip them back over when you see them like that. And I've had people say, oh, these horseshoe crabs are on the beach, and I keep running them back into the sea. Well, they're coming up to the beach to lay eggs, so you don't have to run them back into the water. They wait for the high tide to come back and swim back on their own. But we just say, if they're upside down, you can give them a helping hand and turn them upside right. Okay, so some really interesting biology. I had a note up that they have book gills, they're called, because there is a leathery flap, see, that covers the gills, and the gills are little thin pages of a book almost. And so as long as the horseshoe crab has this leather covering over them and they stay moist, it can stay out of the water for 6 to 8 hours before that tide comes back up. So when you see them on the beaches, they're not going to suffocate because of that nice covering over the gills that they have. And they're really funny animals because their mouth is in the middle of their legs. So each leg, as it joins into the body, is covered with some spines here, and they can crush small shellfish or worms, things that they eat. And they're so cool evolutionarily because they are what is known as living fossils. So their relatives came about more than 400 million years ago. Some 445 million years are some of the oldest fossils. And the fossils look very similar to what horseshoe crabs look like today. That's why we call them sort of living fossils. Here's humans up here. We're like way at the end of evolutionary time from this picture. But if you look back to look at the Ordovician life when horseshoe crabs came about, the land was uninhabitable. It was hot and full of volcanic activity, but the oceans were teeming with life. And so this is an artist rendition from the Peabody Museum, I believe, showing you what was alive during the Ordovician. Down here is our friend, the horseshoe crab. So very interesting life cycle. Again, at the Peabody Museum, when it reopens, they've closed right now for renovations, but it should be very exciting when they reopen their exhibits. This is a fossil from Morocco that Peter Van Roy and Derek Briggs found from the Ordovician. Here's one from the time of the dinosaurs, 65 million years ago, and it looks just like that one I showed you on the beach. Now, just because their morphology hasn't changed, it doesn't mean they don't evolve. In fact, they have quite high genetic diversity, and they're constantly dealing with bacteria in the water, and their immune system is quite diverse. So they have a lot of genetic diversity and evolution going on. What's another cool fact is that horseshoe crabs have survived the 5 great mass extinctions. And so the first big extinction occurred at the end of the Ordovician, and we lost a lot of different species. And then most of you might have heard of the Great Permian extinction, where 95% of the families of organisms on Earth disappeared. And then, of course, most of you have heard about the meteor that hit the Earth and wiped out the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. Well, the horseshoe crab has survived through evolutionary time to this day. And the big question is, can they survive us? Can they survive living with humans with our love of living on the shorelines and armoring the shores? So the first question is like, why do you think they have survived over all these years? And maybe before we go through this, I could see if Russell, if there's any questions that have come in on their basic biology before I go over their ecology.
Yes, we do have some questions.
Okay.
Someone wants to know, are they found in the Caribbean?
No, they are not. They are in the pet trade, and sometimes they might get released by people, but there's no breeding population that I know of in the Caribbean.
Another question, why the name horseshoe, and what are they called in other places in the world?
Aha! Oh, there's all the different languages. They have lots of names. Kabuto in Japan, but anyway, they call in English, the one in China, they call it the tri-spine horseshoe crab because it has 3 spines off the back of the shell. The horseshoe comes from the shape of its front shell. It's called the prosoma. It looks like the curve of a horse's shoe, or a horseshoe that you put on a horse. So that's where that comes from. And they have lots, you're giggling. They have lots of different names in different languages. But usually in English, the ones in Asia are also called horseshoe crabs. One is a tri-spine horseshoe crab. One is the mangrove horseshoe crab because it lives in the mangroves. Anyway, so that's any other questions?
Someone would like a walkthrough of how they're tagged.
Yes, we're going to do that toward the end. I'll show you how we tag. Okay.
And then, does tagging disturb their mating?
No, we've been doing this for 20 years, and we've gotten to the point where we can tag them without even moving them. And they are not, when they're up on the beach and you see them on dry land, they're not laying eggs. They're only laying eggs when they're completely covered with water. So that's why they follow the high tide up. And they are not actively laying all the time. So we look for signs. If they're actively laying, we don't tag them. But the most times at low tide, when we see them buried in the beach, they're just waiting for the high tide to come back. So we can just quickly tag them and off they go. There's no mortality based on the tagging. We did a study on that. And so it's kind of like getting your ear pierced. Okay.
Someone would like to know that you said they had 10 eyes and they would like them pointed out, all of the 10
All
of them.
10. So they, right, I don't know if I can go back. Can I go back? We'll go back. So there's 3 in the front on the shell. Oh, this is way back. Okay, so there's 3 up here, the eye spots. There's 2 sort of on, they're called ventral eyes. There's 2, 1 right behind the compound eye, and then there's 2 right above the mouth on the flip side. So those are all the eyes that we know of. Oh, and I know there's also a set of light receptors that run down the telson. So that's kind of cool. Forgot to mention that. So very good.
We can do some more questions later.
All right, let's go on to, so horseshoe crabs are generalists. In other words, they don't have really sort of picky requirements for survival. So for example, temperatures. So we find them in Maine, so they like cold water, and we find them in the Yucatan Peninsula, in Florida, so they like hot water. And we find the babies, this is a group of juvenile horseshoe crabs in this shot. We find them in the marshes where the little pools can be, 80, 90 degrees in the summer, and they hang out. So they have a wide temperature range. They're really good at surviving in low oxygen. They don't require a lot of oxygen. So when we have the oxygen depletion that occurs in the sound in the late summer, August and September, the hypoxic events, they call it, the horseshoe crabs don't die off from that. The fish do, but the horseshoe crabs can survive. And they can tolerate variation in salinity, but they cannot live in fresh water, so that they have limits to that. But they can live in brackish waters. That's why they're found in the estuaries, where their rivers empty into the ocean. And they like live in the shallows and deep water. They eat whatever they can get their mouths around. So they like worms, shellfish, things, whatever's in the benthic zone. They're even tolerant of pollution. So some organisms are very intolerant, right? If just a little bit of, let's say, cadmium or lead would kill them off, whereas it takes more so to kill off a horseshoe crab. So I always call them, they're tough animals. So they're very tolerant of changing environmental conditions. And even in mate choice, females are not choosy. They take whatever males are out there, and they just get together without too much fanfare. What is happening is that it has been noted through trawls where you drag a net behind a boat. The DEP does this in several places throughout the year, several times a year. And each time they count all the organisms they find there, and they keep track of population levels that way. And what they found was that the horseshoe crab population is in decline, greatly so. And so, in our own data from tagging and our own counts that we do, spawning counts on the beaches, have also documented that. And so there's like, well, why is there this decline? What's happening to the horseshoe crab? So as I mentioned, they need those open estuaries to lay eggs and to feed. If you wall off the land from the sea, that does in the horseshoe crabs. So whenever you see seawalls like this and like this, that is not going to be habitat for horseshoe crabs any longer. And there are other species as well, like the diamondback terrapin. Many shorebirds need that land-sea interface to survive. We also harvest horseshoe crabs, and we have predators of the eggs. Everybody loves to eat horseshoe crab eggs, including this little guy who's an Asian shore crab, an invasive species on our shorelines. They aggressively feed on baby horseshoe crabs and eggs. Why do we harvest? So the fishermen take the crabs for bait in the whelk fishery and the eel fishery. You can make a fairly good living on selling these organisms on the open market. And so the horseshoe crab is the best bait they've found so far when they're trying to catch these other species. So economically, they're very important. And our friends in Asia also like to eat them. So we have not usually eat horseshoe crabs in the US. I have found a record back in the early or late 1800s where they used to make soup out of them, but nowadays, mostly in Asia, is the consumption of horseshoe crabs on the market. And the global American eel market is pretty amazing in terms of the amount of money that eel, I don't know if any of you eat sushi, but eel is a common food in sushi. Now, the other aspect and why everyone listening to this call can actually thank the horseshoe crab for their good health, because we found, serendipitously actually, scientists found up at Woods Hole a product in the horseshoe crab blood called Limulus lysate, but never mind. But anyway, these little cells in the blood that coagulate on contact when there's bacteria or bacteria toxin present. So it's a very good test, if you can imagine, for vaccines. You don't want bacteria in the vaccine that you're going to get if we ever get a vaccine for COVID-19, and everyone's hoping we do. Those vaccines have to be tested with horseshoe crab blood to make sure that the vaccines are pure. So their blood is worth millions on the market, because not only does everyone in the US use this product, but everyone around the world uses this product. Even so much so that they used to send it up in space with our astronauts. And this little test kit was the LAL. And if an astronaut had a sore throat, he could test using the horseshoe crab blood in the kit to see if it was bacterial or viral and know whether to take antibiotics or not. So that's pretty cool. So the pharmaceutical companies that produce this product will take the animals, bleed them, and then let them go. So they try not to cause death of the organisms, although 10 to 20% of them do tend to die from this process. So they're important to our health, and they're also important to the environment, as I said. There are over 20 species or more that live on or around horseshoe crabs. We find all sorts of things living on their shells and around their mouth, etc. This little flatworm lives only on horseshoe crabs. So as the horseshoe crab declines, so does this species. And we know that also birds depend on the horseshoe crab eggs. Shorebirds are particularly interested in feeding because they have such a long migratory route. A lot of our shorebirds overwinter in South America or the Caribbean, and then fly up the East Coast, feeding along the way, and many stop in Delaware Bay and feed on the horseshoe crab eggs there, and then head up to the Arctic area to lay their own eggs. So to fuel these flights, these birds can double their weight just by consuming horseshoe crab eggs. It's like a McDonald's hamburger. They double their weight in 2 weeks' time. So they don't have to spend a lot of time feeding, and they can get fat very quickly to move on their way. So here's our beaches, and very shortly, in the next 2 weeks actually, we should see lots of horseshoe crabs coming up. This is not the Connecticut coastline. This is down in Delaware, and we should have seen this kind of animal abundance on our own coasts, and so we're quite concerned that their numbers are declining. Now, What are the reasons? So more reasons for the decline? Well, we have a lot of human pollution going on. Urban estuaries are tough for survival of lots of species because of all of the things we do to the water, all the things we do to the air, and how we change the different coastlines, hardening with hardened structures, etc. So here's a display that I wanted you to look at, and it looks at links to why horseshoe crabs are dominant or foundational species, as they're called. So when they're in high abundance, there are many, many different shorebirds that depend on their eggs for feeding in the spring. And we just did a quick count, and there's some 12 or 14 species of bird that we saw feeding on the horseshoe crab eggs, where they have millions of horseshoe crabs come up in the Delaware Bay region to lay eggs. Now, when you look in Long Island Sound, the eggs remain buried. The horseshoe crab density is low, so they don't disturb their nesting, and so there's very few birds actually that can even find the eggs to feed on. And if a storm disturbs the nest and washes the eggs up, then certainly the forage fish would come up and feed on them. So as the biomass of the horseshoe crab increases, we see lots of links to other species. As the biomass of horseshoe crabs decline, we see those links are broken. So if you can imagine, this is a very old picture from the 1930s, I believe. This is all horseshoe crabs coming up to lay eggs by the multiple millions. In fact, they used to stack them up, put them on, grind them up and put them on agricultural land for fertilizer. And so our beaches are getting emptier. And so we started Project Limulus in 1998 to figure out what they need to survive and how can we change things to get allow the horseshoe crab to survive in the Sound and become abundant. So we need an abundant population. So we wanted to understand their basic ecology. Where do they go? What's the sex ratio? What is their mating behavior? So we found early on that they shifted down in Delaware. They have multiple males around one female, but here in Connecticut, there's only one male per female that usually come up. And then sort of, if we can age them, they're very difficult to age. I'll show you in a minute. You know, we've divided them into three classes, sort of young, middle-aged, and old adults. And ultimately, we want to collect all this data, particularly using our citizen scientists and volunteers, to enhance the state management plan, help the state manage the species so we can increase their abundance. So the first question was, when I was in graduate school, I did a study on sea turtles. And we found, you know, that sea turtles, or it's known that they come up to the same beach every year to lay eggs, that in fact, the beach they were born on, they'll come back to lay their own eggs. And the question was, wow, do horseshoe crabs do that? And one way you can find out is to tag them. And we were doing a tagging study down in the Caribbean, in Puerto Rico actually, trying to see if these hawksbill sea turtles came back. And we could do the same with horseshoe crabs. So how we tag them. So this is an awl that's used in leather making, you know, to punch hole in leather. And we welded a washer on so that it just goes through and the hole doesn't get too big. And so we put a small hole in the shell, and then we push the tab of this tag right through that hole. And that's how you tag them. It's not hard at all. But we do record, each tag has a unique number, and that number is associated with our database onto whether it was a male or female, whether she was mating, and what let's see what beach she's on, all of those things. And so if you find one, so even though we have to keep social distancing up this summer, if you go for a walk on the beach and you see a horseshoe crab with a tag on it, take a picture of it or write it down and email us, or you can call the phone number on the tag and report it. Now, when I first started this study in the late 90s and early 2000s, we were making our own tags. And if you find one like this, that'll be over 10, 15 years old. So it would be very cool if you find, that's my office phone number, and it only has 5 digits on the number instead of 6. So just let me know if you find one of these. They're old and no longer yellow. But this is the federal tag from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It says Annapolis, Maryland, but they're not from Annapolis, Maryland. This is the office that collects the data for us. Do look for those while you're walking. Now, the Connecticut Deep realized from our data and from their own data that the horseshoe crab population is in decline. So in 2006, they established 3 no harvest zones. So Milford Point, Sandy Point in West Haven, and Menakatishuk Island, did not allow harvesters to take horseshoe crabs off those 3 beaches. So why did they do that? They were hoping to establish enough area so that enough horseshoe crabs were saved so that they would replenish the population. So we decided to, in the, I guess it was the 2008 through 2013, we tried to get as many volunteers as we can and put out as many tags as we can. Some close to 80,000 tags were put out to find out where these animals were going, how to better manage them, etc. And our volunteers did a wonderful job in getting those tags out. And so what we learned is the sex ratio is a bit off from 50-50, which is what you would be more likely to see in most organisms. So there are fewer females, meaning that we should definitely preserve those females we have, that we should not be harvesting females. And they are the ones putting the eggs in the sand. So if we want to increase the population, we should be protecting those females. And we had people tagging all over. These were just areas where we have records of someone tagging. Sometimes people would tag just one summer and not again. Other areas we have years and years of data from. And this shows you when people find an animal that's tagged and call it in. So we had some show up in Cape Cod. We had some outliers. One of our tagged horseshoe crabs from Long Island Sound ended up in Maine, and a few ended up down south. These might have gone on a truck and went through the bleeding program that they have down there, but we're not sure. The norm is that about of the animals, say we tag at Sandy Point and recapture, 50% show up again at New Haven. So site fidelity, they sometimes, more than 50% of the time, like to come back to the same area, but they also have numbers that go, are found east, and some that are found west, and some that cross the sound as well. So now we know that they don't rely on just one beach, although once they find a nice area to lay eggs, they do tend to come back to them. Here is a, what would you call it, an app that you can download and play with yourself. We uploaded a bunch of our data, and you can put in whatever series of years, and then you can put in any of these boxes. Let's say you're tagging out in Stonington and you want to know where do your Stonington animals end up. You can put that in this app and it'll show you where the animals were found. So those of you tagging from Milford to Norwalk, a lot of the tags have shown up on Long Island, and many more have shown up going to other beaches in Connecticut. So here's just a summary of a bunch of tags, recaptures that we found. So about 95% of the animals in the sound stay in the sound. And so getting back to these 3 no harvest zones, why were they established? So it was to increase the frequency and pairs of horseshoe crabs that come up to lay eggs. They were hoping to increase the multiple male-female mating. Sort of the more matings you have, the more genetic diversity you have of those eggs. And you want a healthy, genetically healthy population. And reduce the number of females that come up with no mates at all. One observation that many of our citizen scientists and myself have found is that females are coming up and they don't have a mate. And that's not good for reproduction. They cannot lay fertilized eggs, and the density of the population is so low that they cannot find each other. So this is a problem when you're trying to increase the population in the sound. So instead, we continued this monitoring from 2008 to 2018. Now it takes 10 years to grow a horseshoe crab from an egg to an adult. And so since 2006, we've been following the population. If the no harvest zones are working, we should see an increase in pairs. Instead, we see a decline. We should see a increase in multiple matings, and that has been relatively stable and very low. So very few multiple matings still. And we've seen an increase in the number of females coming up without a mate. So we're not winning the battle in terms of increasing the density, and we haven't even halted the decline yet. So this is why I wanted to give this talk, was to encourage people to help us, if we can this year, collect a little bit of data. Now, we're not going to be tagging much because our tagging tends to draw crowds, and we all have to be safe. And I don't want anyone to go to a beach that's closed. But if you do want to volunteer, you can walk maybe with a member of your family. And what you can do is you measure length of beach, measure length of beach, and then you can count all the crabs you find in 3 meters from the edge of water. So there are people out there who are trained, and you can contact, and we're hoping that a few people anyway can do a little bit of counting for us this year. So our numbers, when you calculate all of that area of beach covered and look at the density of females spawning, we have 0.008 females per meter squared. And down in Delaware, they have at least 1 female per meter squared. So you can see how low our population is. And this is the data from that spawning index, showing it does jump around year to year. However, the trend is still in the downward direction. And so we have volunteers doing the counting. And actually tonight, there's a full moon, and it's a day for counting, or tonight I should say, a night of counting, if anyone wants to go out and look, although I believe the water is too cold. So it's unlikely the animals will be up yet. Probably the first time you'll see horseshoe crabs will be in 2 weeks' time during the new moon. And we also look at aging. I was telling you that we were going to try to age this population. This is a brand newly molted adult. They look like a brand new car. They're shiny. They even have a little fur on the edges of the shell. And this is so-called, and that's a condition 1. Condition 2 is kind of middle-aged. You're kind of starting to gray around the edges, getting a little bit of scuffed up. Horseshoe crabs stop molting once they become adults, and so their shells begin to wear. And this is the old adult, that the shell is black. It has pits. There's things growing all over it, organisms growing on it. So you often will see these on the beach in terms of their age, looking at shell condition, we call it. Now, what we're finding is that very few coming up are these newly minted adults, and so recruitment is a problem, and we're trying to look at why that is happening. So overall, and we'll get to your questions coming up next, we have a low density and aging horseshoe crab population, low recruitment of new adults, so we don't have a lot of juveniles surviving. And Long Island Sound population is reproducing well below its maximum rate. As long as we keep finding females without mates on the beach, this is gonna be a problem. And so we're recommending a moratorium on the harvest, and I know Connecticut Deep is considering this. And they're going to have to change their regulations, not this year, but the next year. And it would be really good for them to collaborate with New York and have one management plan, because this population is one population. So our research, both in terms of the genetic testing we did and the tag data, shows us that these animals all live in the Sound. Doesn't matter if you're from New York or Connecticut. It's one big happy group. And believe it or not, there's something to think about, that we do not have any marine protected areas in Long Island Sound. You can harvest what you want. You can, you know, they have regulations on harvesting things, but the bottom of the Sound is not protected. There's trawling, there's all sorts of human activity everywhere. There's no one area where we don't harvest things. And that can be a problem. Particularly the juveniles, if you think about it, need food to survive. And do they have that? So, and the other project I work on is habitat restoration. And so if you want to, when this COVID-19 passes and we're allowed to go back together again, you can come visit at Stratford Point. We have a new living shoreline restoration going on there. So we need your help if you can safely walk the beach. You can look for tagged animals and let us know what you see. You're welcome to help us, email us, but also you must remain safe and social distance. So there are other horseshoe crab counts going all around New England. We all do it the same way. And I think I'll just leave it here and start answering your questions. Okay,
So the first question I got was, do the spines have any purpose?
Protection for sure. The little ones particularly are kind of like a pincushion almost. And so I think it may prevent, say, a bird from picking it up and chomping on it. Yeah, mostly for protection. There are nerve endings on some of the spines on the sides of the adults. The adults do not have very many predators other than humans. They may be for sensing the environment around them. So that's a good question.
The other question, and there are actually two similar questions. So how does the population in Long Island Sound compared to the rest of the Northeast? And how's the population, or do they do better in Long Island Sound versus out in the ocean?
So in New England, the populations are low but stable in Massachusetts and Rhode Island and New Hampshire. Maine, it's a very small population. They're not harvested at all, but again, low but stable. So Connecticut and New York have been called out on by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission as having a declining population. So the other states, even in the South, most of the states have either they're stable or they're increasing. So we're the only two states that got called out for declining.
I think you kind of answered this.
I'm trying.
What can we do to help? They're a scout group. And they want to know if they can help.
Yes, scouting. So we do, under normal conditions, we take scouts out with us and we teach them, what to look for on the beaches. And we also have an Earth Day celebration, which has passed, of course, and we also do planting. So, you know, everybody can sort of care for their habitat in their backyards. That sort of thing is really important. For the horseshoe crab, if you're just walking the beach, just keep us informed on what you're finding. And if you see any tags on them, definitely get that number that's on them. Leave the tag on the animal and leave the animal in the water. But if you can take a picture of it even and email it to us, it gives us information on, you know, where they come from and where they go.
Is there a minimum age for tagging?
No, we tagged with preschoolers all the way to my oldest tagger. I think she was 92. So,
I think they mean crabs.
oh,
Is there
the
a minimum?
crab. So we only tag the adults because the juveniles molt and the tag wouldn't stay. So they stop molting between 10 and 12 years of age. And then we know they're adults because they're coming up on the beach to lay eggs. And so those are the ones that we tag. Is that what they meant?
Yeah. How were the benefits discovered? You were talked about their blood, and how did they discover that?
So it was just, you're not going to believe this one. So they were, the horseshoe crab had been used for study because its optic nerve is very large. And so actually the man who studied the optic nerve of the horseshoe crab won a Nobel Prize because it led to our understanding of the human optic nerve system and how it works, because it was a much simpler system in the horseshoe crab. So that's pretty cool. But they had the crabs dissected on the lab bench. And when the blood landed on the lab bench, it coagulated instantly, meaning, and they figured out that it was reacting to the bacteria on the lab bench. So it was, as I mentioned, a lot of discoveries in science are serendipitously discovered. So they realized that this could be actually very useful to have a product that reacts on contact with bacteria. And it's used for testing all the medical devices. If you're getting like a knee replacement, they test those, you know, before it goes into the human body, it's tested with this product to make sure there's no bacterial toxin on it. So it's pretty cool.
In Asia, you said they eat them. What part of the horseshoe crab do they eat?
So they eat the females mostly because they have inside that big helmet head of theirs is the eggs float around. They have an open system. So they will eat the eggs like caviar.
And what do they do in the winter?
In the winter, we put some sonar tags on them and tried to follow them around. And it seems that they tend to stop moving around so much and they bury in the mud. We wanted to test if they left the sound. We thought maybe they migrated out of the sound and then came back later. But they just go down a little bit deeper water and bury in the mud, basically. And they start becoming active again late February, early March. We had some divers find them moving around in March, and actually the males hook up with the females as early as March, and he stays with her through July. So he doesn't eat that whole time. So that's pretty cool.
How long does it take for the eggs to hatch? And how long do the horseshoe crabs live?
So the horseshoe crab eggs vary in their hatching time because it's based on temperature and oxygen, things like that. But overall, they will be laid in the next couple weeks through June. Then they start hatching like 2 to 3 weeks after that. So they don't stay in the egg stage very long. Well, there's a few anecdotal findings of eggs that overwinter. So a few might be able to do that and hatch the following spring, but most of them will hatch in 2 to 3 weeks. And then, what was the other question?
How long do the horseshoe crabs live?
So as you saw, it was hard to age them, hard to know how old they are. So we have tagged some new adults sort of in that condition 1 stage, and we've recaptured tags up to 10 years, 11 years out. So if it takes 10 years to make an adult horseshoe crab, they can live between 20 and 25 years, we think.
Someone is asking about the pharmaceutical companies coming up with a synthetic version of their blood.
There are several products actually that are synthetically made that can substitute for the LAL, but the companies have to pay a lot of money to run tests and get them through the government, and the government has to approve the new product before they will allow the switch over. So it can be very costly to a company to do that, where using the horseshoe crab blood is almost for free, right? They pay the fishermen a little bit of money to bring them the crabs, and they can produce the product very inexpensively. So it will take a shutdown of that industry in order for them to switch to the products that are available synthetically.
Does someone monitor the no harvest zones?
No, they don't even monitor the harvest zones other than the Project Limulus volunteers. So I get a lot of emails about, I saw harvesters out. So if we see that, we do call. There's a few conservation officers out there that work for DEEP, and but all of the reporting on the harvest is self-reporting. So the fishermen tell Connecticut DEEP how many they've taken, and there's a limit on how many you can take. So there's not enough money, unfortunately, in the government coffers to pay for monitoring.
Someone's asking about raising them in a lab to increase the population and not take them from the wild.
Right. So they're very difficult to raise. They're very particular, it seems, when they just don't adapt well to captivity. They keep like bumping their heads against the glass, and they're just not happy animals in captivity. And sometimes they stop molting. Sometimes they stop eating. So it's been quite a challenge. Now, a few people have been able to find the secret and get a few animals raise them for 10 years to adults. But it's not lucrative. It doesn't pay, in other words. And then when you bring adults into captivity, there's one group that has done it, and they've been trying to keep the animals alive in captivity, like in an enclosed area that's outside, actually, in an estuary, and bleed just those animals and not take the ones from the wild. So there is one group trying to do that, just keeping a group of adults, fed well and alive in captivity. But most who have tried to do that, they die in captivity within a year. So it's hard to keep them alive.
So I think you answered this, but when's the best time to look for them?
So they're going to start coming up so what they do is the male and females, the males hang on to the back of the females slightly larger, and they come up on the high tide. So tonight at midnight, where I was going to go was Stratford, I think, and Milford, but check the tides in your local area, and they follow the high tide up, and then they'll start to nest, like dig holes in the shoreline and deposit the eggs while the water is covering them. So around the mean tide area, they're going to be digging around. So a good place to see them actually is Sandy Point in West Haven, because it's an open beach and you're allowed to walk out there. And if you wait till the end of May, you will definitely see them up on the beach there laying eggs. And at Milford Point, you can see them at low tide because they bury in. The tide goes out too fast, and it's low sloping beach, so they just bury in and wait for the tide to come back up. And you should be able to see them from about now or the next 2 weeks through June. Okay.
I think we covered most of the questions. There was one about polygamous versus monogamous.
Yes. So what we found also is that, so down in Delaware Bay, they often, a female will come up between what they say 50 and 60% of the females will have one male attached. The males have claspers on their front legs, look like boxing gloves, and they hold on to the back of the female. But while she's laying the eggs, 2 other males can come in from the side and fertilize the eggs. So sometimes you'll see piles of males all on top of a female laying eggs. So that's polygamy. And then what we find in Connecticut mostly are just pairs, because the density of population is so low. You'll see just the female with a male attached to the back coming up. And, so when we've been tagging them, we've been trying not to disturb them, not to pull them apart, and have them tagged when they're still together. So it's still possible to do that.
Had a question about, does the flashlight bother them on the beach? And you also mentioned the water temperature. What's a good temperature for them if it's too cold now?
I think it was around, was it 55? I can't remember the exact temperature, but I still think it's in the 40s, the temperature. We'll have to take our thermometers out and check it.
It was the last time I checked, yeah.
Yeah, was it? Okay.
It's a little chilly here right now.
Yeah, so it will take a few days in the 70s, ambient temperature before the water warms up for them. But there's a lot of variation. Horseshoe crabs don't read the book. So they'll start, we might start to see them tonight, but I doubt you'll see very many. So I would definitely check right around the end of May, but you should be able to find them by then. The water will be warm enough.
And do the flashlights bother them while you're out?
The flashlights, no. They tend to look for the lights on the beaches because the sand reflects the moonlight and the sunlight, so they look for that light to come up. So it doesn't seem to bother them. Not much bothers the horseshoe crabs.
All right. Well, I want to thank you. I think this was a fascinating presentation. Hopefully we have lots of people that are going to be out searching for horseshoe crabs and letting you know what they find, because that's the part that's really interesting to me, is what they come up with.
So I put up, on our website, I put up the dates, and I just put up the dates now when people will be doing the counts. And there's a picture of my students counting with the rope. But if you've never done it before, we can walk you through it. And there's on Project Limulus website on the Sacred Heart page is a data sheet, and there's a guide to how to do it. Protocol.
That's awesome.
All right.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody who tuned in.
Yes, thank you.
And I think Sue is there.
Yes, I am. Yep. And this has been recorded, and the chat has been also saved. So I will be sending that to you, Russ, if you or Dr. Matei would like to post it or have it available for others. That is totally up to you.
All right. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Be safe.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Gianna, you're so cute.
Russ, are you still on?
I am here.
Okay, I got a question for you. Are you on COEA?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Then I'm going to send you an email about a turtle thing we have going on. If you want to send a picture and photograph of any education turtles, we'll be having a slideshow for turtle awareness or National Turtle Day, which is May 23rd, and we're going to post that on COEEA. So if you want to include your turtles, Friday's our deadline.
All right, that's cool.
Thank
Definitely.
you. I'll catch you with an email. Bye-bye to all.
Thank you.
Mhm.